The wind curled low across the prairie, carrying the scent of rain and dust, pressing against the boards of a cabin that leaned with the years. Inside sat a man whose life had been whittled down to silence. His shoulders were broad but bent, his hands scarred from work and from war, and his eyes dark hollows that caught no light. He had once been a name that carried weight in towns from the borderlands to the river country, a man quick with a rifle and quicker with judgment. But the years had stripped him of fire. The land he kept was more graveyard than home, a stretch of parched soil and brittle grass that bent with every wind as if in mourning. He lived alone because to live with anyone else was unbearable. Once, he had known laughter in these walls, the soft presence of a wife who filled the rooms with warmth, the promise of a child he had never held. Both taken in one night, when riders came under a blood moon, leaving him with only gunpowder smoke and earth turned red. He buried his heart that night, swore at her grave that no woman would ever hold again, and sealed himself in a coffin of his own vow. Since then, the cabin was his world, and silence his companion. The days fell into sameness. He rose before the sun, walked the boundary of his land, fixed what little broke, and split what though he needed none. The motions of life gave him something to do with his hands, but not with his spirit. Evenings came with whiskey and the low groan of his rocking chair, a rifle always propped against the wall. When the bottle was near empty, he would speak to no one but himself, muttering that the land was dying, that it ought to take him with it. The world beyond his fences carried on in fire and violence, but he chose not to see it. Yet even as he shut it out, fragments still reached him. On the rare trips into town for supplies, whispers stirred in the saloon, talk of a gang gathering strength, preying on ranchers and widows, torching homes in the night. He would sip his drink in silence, his jaw tight, then ride home before the words could find their way under his skin. He told himself it was not his fight anymore. He told himself the world was nothing to him. Still, when he closed his eyes at night, dreams betrayed him, his wife's face in the rain, the echo of a child's cry that never was. He would wake with his chest tight, gripping the sheets as though he had been drowning. The land outside mirrored his grief. Dust devils crept across the flats, sagebrush withered in the heat, and the sky often boiled with thunder, without yielding rain. The air carried the ache of things unfinished. He heard it and felt it, but he pressed deeper into solitude, as if denial could be armor. It was on such a night, when the clouds had broken open and rain came down hard on the roof, that the rhythm of his world shifted. He had just poured his last measure of whiskey when a sound cut through the storm, a knock at the door, sharp, urgent. His whole body went rigid. He never had visitors. He waited, certain he had imagined it. The rain roared. The wind battered the shutters. Then it came again, softer this time, but heavier somehow, as if the knocker's strength was running out. His hand went to the rifle without thought. Quietly, he moved the door, listening for any sound beyond it. Nothing but the hammering rain. He could leave it closed. Whoever was out there could move on, or not move at all. But something in that second knock unsettled him. It carried no threat. It carried desperation. He unlatched the door. Lightning split the night, and in its glare he saw a woman, soaked to the bone, her hair plastered against her face, her arms around a small child clinging to her skirts. Their eyes were wide, more with fear than with rain. For a heartbeat, no words came. They looked like they had been carved out of the storm itself, delivered to his doorstep by some cruel trick of fate. The woman's lips trembled before she found her voice, low and ragged. "Please," she said. "They'll kill us if you don't let us in." The child's hand clutched tighter at her, and the man felt the weight of years shift inside his chest, like a door he had nailed shut straining on its hinges. The rain poured harder, drumming on the roof as if demanding his choice. And for the first time in a long while, he was not certain what it would be. The rifle stayed heavy in his hand as he stepped aside, letting the woman and child cross the threshold. Water dripped from their clothes onto the warped floorboards, leaving dark stains that spread like shadows. The woman's breath came quick and sharp, her body half turned as though she expected pursuit at any moment. The child pressed against her, wide-eyed, too frightened to cry. He closed the door behind them, the latch clicking into place louder than thunder. For a long moment no one spoke. She finally met his eyes. There was no softness in her gaze, only the raw edge of survival. She looked at him as one might look at a stranger found on a cliff's edge, dangerous but necessary. He realized she was not pleading for kindness. She was demanding a chance to live. He asked no questions at first, only motioned toward the fire. She led the child closer, holding out trembling hands to the flames. Steam rose from their clothes as heat drove the water away. He studied them. The child was small, dark hair tangled, face pale with exhaustion. The woman looked worn but not weak. Her hands bore the scars of work. Her shoulders carried the stiffness of someone too long on the run. There was no sign of vanity, only grit. She caught him staring and lifted her chin, as if to remind him she had not come to beg. "They're tracking us," she said at last, voice low. "Riders. They burned a farmstead 2 nights back. We barely got away." He said nothing. His silence was a wall he had built long ago, and few could climb it. Yet something in the way her voice cracked around a word burned reached inside him, pressing on memories he had locked away. The child tugged at her sleeve, whispering for food. He moved without thinking, fetching a heel of bread and jerky from the shelf. The boy took it greedily, chewing with small, desperate bites. The woman's eyes softened for the first time as she watched her child eat. Then she looked back to him. "You don't owe us anything," she said. "If you send us away, I'll understand. But you know what they'll do if they find us." The words hung heavy between them. He did know. He had seen worse. He turned from her, poured himself water, though his hands trembled as he lifted the cup. He had promised himself he would never again be pulled into the wars of others. Yet now fate had put them under his roof. The hours crawled. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin every sound was magnified. The child's quiet breathing as he drifted asleep, the fire's crackle, the creak of the old chair beneath him. The woman sat opposite, eyes sharp despite her weariness, as though expecting him to turn them out at any moment. He found himself speaking before he intended to. "What's his name?" She hesitated, then answered. "Eli." The name caught in his chest. He repeated it softly, then fell silent again. He noticed her watching him closely, as though weighing his measure. "You live out here alone?" she asked. "Yes." "For how long?" "Too long." The fire cast shadows across his face, hiding more than it revealed. She seemed to sense that questions would get her nowhere, yet she did not let the silence die. "You've heard about them," she said. "The gang. They take what they want, leave nothing but ash. They won't stop until someone stands against them." His jaw clenched. He had heard. He had chosen to forget. But now the past pressed close, whispering in the hiss of rain against the roof. He tried to force himself back into the comfort of indifference, but the child's small figure curled against the blanket made it impossible. He could almost see another child, one he had never met, one buried before birth in a graveyard he had dug with his own hands. When midnight came, the storm broke, leaving a silence sharper than the thunder before it. He stepped outside, lantern in hand, scanning the horizon. The land glistened with wet earth, but the air carried no peace. He thought he saw movement far off, a flicker on the ridge line, and his grip on the lantern tightened. If they had been followed, time was short. Back inside, he found her awake, waiting. She read his face before he spoke. "They're close? Could be?" She nodded once, without fear, as though she had expected nothing less. "Then it's only a matter of time." Her certainty unsettled him more than her fear would have. He set the rifle by the door, sat heavily, and stared at the fire until the flames blurred. When dawn began to stain the horizon, the child stirred, whimpering in his sleep. She soothed him with a touch, her hand steady though her own eyes were rimmed with sleeplessness. She looked across the fire at him. "You could turn us out now," she said quietly. "Wash your hands of us before they ride in. But you won't." The word struck deep, not as accusation, but as truth. He wanted to deny it, yet found he could not. He had already stepped into the current he had sworn never to enter again. He rose, walked to the window, and pulled the curtain aside. The sky was pale, the land stretching wide and empty, but in the distance a curl of dust lifted faintly against the morning light. Riders. They were coming. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, lined with years of solitude. shadowed with grief. For the first time in years, he felt the pulse of something other than survival. Anger, purpose, dread. He let the curtain fall, turned to the woman and the boy, and knew the vow he made at a graveside was no longer iron. He lifted the rifle from its place by the door, tested its weight, and spoke words that surprised even him. If they're hunting you, they'll find more than you waiting. The woman's eyes locked on his, sharp with recognition. She did not smile, but her shoulders eased slightly, as though the burden she carried had shifted. The child, still half asleep, murmured his mother's name. The fire crackled louder, filling the silence that followed. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying the smell of dust and gunpowder. The morning stretch taut as wire. He saddled the horse in silence while the woman packed what little food remained. The boy clutched a blanket too worn to hold warmth, his eyes darting to the door as though he already knew danger would ride through it. The air outside was sharp with the smell of wet earth, the calm after storm, but the horizon told a different story. Dust rose faint and steady on the far ridge, a signal of pursuit. He remembered the hesitation in his chest when he killed the scouts the night before. 2 men who had been shadows until the rifle cracked and the night swallowed them. He had hidden the bodies beneath brush, but their absence would be noticed. By now, the gang would be hunting in earnest. The woman watched him as he adjusted the saddle straps, and though she said nothing, her silence pressed him harder than any words could. They set out at first light. The prairie spread wide and bleak, dew shining on sage, the land scarred by old wagon ruts that cut like wounds across the soil. Every hoofbeat echoed his own unease. He tried to ride in front, to keep the boy from seeing the hand that gripped the rifle stock too tight, but the woman's steady gaze lingered on him, a weight as constant as the sun climbing behind them. By midday they reached a canyon where red stone rose sheer on both sides, shadows spilling long across the floor. The boy asked if it was safe. The man did not answer. He could feel the canyon closing around them, a throat waiting to choke. Yet they pushed on. The woman rode near, her hand steady on the reins, her posture betraying neither fear nor fatigue. She was unlike anyone he had known, neither hardened outlaw nor sheltered settler, but something in between, carved from endurance and necessity. That night, they camped by a dry creek bed. The fire was small, its glow barely reaching their faces. He sat apart, oiling his rifle, while the woman laid the boy down beneath a blanket. When she joined him, her eyes reflected the flames, bright yet guarded. "You didn't have to come with us," she said. "You didn't give me a choice. You had won. You still do." Her tone was even, but he heard the unspoken challenge. He stared at the rifle in his hands, saw in its steel the years of blood he had tried to bury. "If I send you away, I might as well put the bullet in myself," he said, "because that's what it would mean. I've done enough watching." She nodded once, and though her face revealed little, he sensed her approval. For while they listened to the wind shift through the canyon, a low, mournful whistle that sounded like voices long dead. Sleep was thin that night. He woke often, hand reaching for the rifle, eyes scanning the ridges. Each time he thought of the vow he had once made, and how it had already begun to crumble under the weight of the woman's presence and the boy's quiet breathing. He wondered if redemption was found not in solitude, but in standing against the very things he had fled. By dawn, smoke smudged the horizon behind them, another farmstead burning. The gang was tightening its grip, making examples of those who resisted. The boy saw it and whispered to his mother, fear trembling in his small voice. She answered with calm words, but her hand brushed the child's hair in a gesture that betrayed her own dread. When they reached the outskirts of a town by the third evening, the air was heavy with unease. Doors shut quickly as they rode past. Curtains shifted, voices hushed. The town lived under the shadow of the gang, its people broken into silence. He felt their stares from behind shutters, some in recognition, some in judgment. His name had not been spoken aloud in years, but it lingered in whispers, a reminder of who he once was. They found shelter in the livery, the horses restless, stamping in the straw. The woman confronted him there, her voice low but edged with steel. "You can't keep running from what you are. These people need someone who will stand. So do we." He looked at her, the lantern's light carving lines across his face. "I've lost enough to this fight, and you'll lose more if you keep turning away." She shot back. "You think burying yourself in that cabin keeps the world out? It only rots you from the inside. At least out here, you can choose what side of the line you stand on." Her words struck deeper than he wanted to admit. He thought of the graves he had left behind, the promise spoken in anger and grief, and realized that vow had been made to a ghost, not to the living. He had been keeping faith with death instead of life. The boy's eyes, watching him from across the stable, made that truth impossible to ignore. That night, he walked the main street alone, the boards creaking beneath his boots, lantern light spilling from shuttered windows. He felt the town breathing fear, felt the weight of expectation pressing on him even in silence. At the far end of the street he stopped, staring into darkness where the road stretched out to the open plains. He imagined the gang riding in, dust cloud rising, flames taking root in every home. He imagined the woman and boy caught in that storm, his hands curled into fists. When he returned, she was waiting. He met her gaze without flinching. "If they come here," he said, "we don't run. We make a stand." The faintest relief flickered across her face, though her voice stayed steady. "Then we'd best prepare." The days that followed moved with a strange rhythm, both heavy and urgent. He taught townsfolk how to hold a rifle, how to find cover, how to listen for hoofbeats in the distance. He and the woman walked the boundaries, setting traps, marking vantage points. The boy followed close, watching with wide eyes, slowly learning that fear could be met with action. The land itself seemed to lean into the coming storm. Winds shifted, dry grass bowed, and every night the moon hung like a blade over the town. The man felt something stirring in him, he thought long dead, not vengeance, but resolve. Each motion, each plan, was a nail driven into the coffin of the vow he had once lived by. On the morning the dust cloud appeared on the horizon, he stood in the street with rifle in hand. The town was quiet, shutters barred, people waiting in silence. The woman moved to his side, her face lit by the hard light of dawn, the boy hidden behind them. The riders were coming fast now. Laughter and shouts carried on the wind, a storm of hooves and steel. He breathed deep, felt the years of silence and solitude fall away, and steadied his grip. For the first time in a long while, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The gang crested the ridge, sunlight glinting off their guns, and the man's voice broke the silence at last. "Hold steady. They're here." The gang rode hard into the street, their horses kicking up dust that turned the morning light into a haze. Shouts and laughter broke the silence, a cruel music that made the shutters tremble. At the center stood the man, rifle steady in his hands, boots planted as though the earth itself held him in place. The woman was at his side, her eyes sharp, the boy hidden in the shadows behind. For a long moment both sides measured one another in silence, the stillness broken only by the restless shifting of horses. The leader of the gang pushed forward, a man with a scar splitting his cheek and a smile that carried no warmth. His eyes lingered on the man at the center of town, recognition flaring into something darker. "I thought you were buried," he drawled. "Seems the dead walk after all." The words cut, but the man did not waver. His voice, when it came, was low and certain. "This town won't burn." Laughter erupted from the riders, a wave of mockery that echoed against the walls. Yet beneath it was unease. They knew his name, knew the stories that clung to him like dust. The leader raised a hand, silencing them. "One man against all of us? You'll die the same way your wife did." The mention of her name was like a blade twisting in his chest, but it did not unsteady his aim. If anything, the fury steadied him. The rifle cracked, shattering the morning. The leader's hat flew from his head as the bullet grazed him and chaos erupted. Gunfire roared. Townsfolk hidden behind barrels, and windows returned fire as he had taught them. The street filled with smoke, horses screaming, men falling into the dirt. He moved with grim precision, each shot deliberate, each motion born of old instincts he thought he had lost. The woman fought beside him, revolver steady in her grip, her movements quick and fearless. Together they held the line, their wills locking the street in defiance. The leader pressed forward, his men driving hard, but the traps they had set tore through the charge, ropes snapping horses off balance, barrels of sand tumbling from rooftops. For every man who broke the defenses, 2 more fell. Yet the gang was relentless, numbers pressing heavy, and the townsfolk's courage wavered. The man saw it in their eyes, felt it in the thinning fire. He knew the battle would break, unless he carried it himself. Through the smoke he saw the leader dismount, striding toward him with pistol drawn, hatred burning like a brand in his gaze. Their eyes locked, and the world narrowed to the 2 of them. This was the man who had ordered the raid years ago, who had taken everything from him under the same cruel grin he wore now. Time seemed to fold, past and present colliding in one brutal instant. They closed the distance. Bullets tore past, but he advanced with unyielding focus, rifle discarded for the revolver at his hip. The first exchange of shots rang deafening, sparks flying from stone as lead struck. He felt one graze his arm, hot pain tearing through flesh, but he pressed on. The leader sneered, circling, every step echoing with old ghosts. "You should have stayed in your hole," the outlaw spat. "Graves don't open easy." The man's voice was raw. "You put me there, but you didn't bury me deep enough." The duel stretched in seconds that felt like hours. Both men bled, both weary, both bound by the weight of the past. The leader fainted, drew fast, and fired. The bullet clipped the man's side, staggering him. Darkness pressed at the edges of his sight, but he steadied, lifted his revolver, and pulled the trigger. The shot struck true, driving the outlaw backward into the dust. For a heartbeat, silence fell. Then the gang faltered, their leader crumpled on the ground, his lifeblood seeping into the dirt. The man stood over him, chest heaving, revolver still raised. The outlaw gasped, hate and disbelief mingling in his fading eyes. He tried to lift his pistol one last time, but the man was faster. The final shot ended it. The gang broke. Some fled, some dropped their weapons and surrendered, their bravado shattered. The townsfolk surged from hiding, voices rising, gunfire dimming to echoes. The woman stood at his side, her face streaked with smoke and dust, revolver slack in her hand. She looked at him, and though no words passed, her gaze carried everything, gratitude, grief, and something he thought he would never see again, trust. He staggered, the pain of his wounds finally pressing hard. She caught his arm, steadying him, her touch grounding him to chaos. Around them the town began to breathe again. People emerging from doorways, the boy running forward to press himself against his mother's side. She bent to hold him, then looked back to the man who stood bleeding but unbroken. The bodies lay scattered, the air heavy with the scent of gunpowder and death. Yet through it came a quiet relief, a sense that something long rotten had been cut away. He had not fought for vengeance alone, though vengeance had been part of it. He had fought because life demanded it, because to hide any longer was to let death rule him. As the sun lowered, casting the street in a glow of copper light, he stood at the edge of town, staring across the horizon. The vow he had spoken years ago echoed in his mind. Never to love again, never to let another soul close. Yet here he was, bloody but alive, standing not in solitude but among people who had leaned on him when it mattered most. He realized the vow had been less a promise than a chain, one that had bound him to grief. The woman joined him, the boy clutching her hand. She did not speak, only laid her free hand gently on his shoulder. The weight was light, but it carried more strength than any oath. He did not look at her, not yet, but the door he had closed long ago stood open in his heart. The prairie wind rose, sweeping to the ruined street, carrying away the last of the gun smoke. In its breath he felt the land itself release, as though it too had been holding tension. He had been broken once, buried in loss, but the fight had unearthed something stronger, the will to live, to protect, to hope. As the sun slipped behind the hills, he whispered the words to himself, half prayer, half confession. Some vows were never meant to last. The woman heard him, though she said nothing. Together they watched the horizon darken, the open land stretching endless before them, no longer a grave but a promise.